Hi, I'm gonna get started showing you some stuff about our book project. I have a couple sheets of sketches with me here, and my design for a book started with the inspiration of our backyard garden. I designed a book that has plants and flowers growing out of it. This really helped me figure out the different angles of the various planes on my piece and the size relationship between the flowers and the book itself. And it helped me plan for that internal support that I'm going to need. I drew on here also some notes about the surface work that I'm going to have. And across the page of the book in the background, I'm going to apply a decal with some writing on it, and I'm going to use my clay stamp in various areas on the flowers. Here are some little maquettes that I've made. On this one, I focused on a paper-like texture on the sides that I'm going to have. And this one obviously focused on flowers and fruit on the inside. I don't want you at all to copy my idea. You guys are going to come up with your own unique books. You might not be making an open face book like what I have, and you're certainly going to have a different message or story and imagery in your book. But I wanted to show you something to help with some of the basics of putting your book together. I noticed my block of clay was starting to get dry in the bag, and so the other day when I wrapped it up, I took a wet rag and just placed it over my block of clay. I want to roll out a bigger slab for this project, and so instead of just cutting a slice off the top, I'm going to lay it down and cut a slice off the side, because I want to be able to roll out a large slab. I'm going to use my rolling pin in different areas of the slab, from the middle going out. Maybe I notice it's thicker over in one spot. I can focus on a different area. I'm going to go in different directions across it. Every minute or so, I'm going to flip it upside down and stretch it out on the other side. When I flip it upside down, I'm also going to rotate it to force myself to stretch it in all different directions. Again, if you don't have a wood rolling pin at home, you could use a flat-sided water bottle. You could use a flat-sided wine bottle or any kind of beverage bottle. If you want to come into Open Labs at Clark and just come in to roll out your slabs, that would be fine also. You could roll them out on the big work tables we have there and the big nice rolling pins we have there. And then you could just transport your slabs home to do the building part of this project at home with some nicely made slabs that you did at Clark. This slab is still pretty thick, but if this was going to be, say, the base part of my project or something very structural within the piece, I might want to leave it this thick. This is about 1/2 inch thick. Since this slab is not for a main structural part of my book, I'm going to go ahead and thin it down some more. This is closer to 3/8 of an inch thick, which for me is good medium thickness. I'm going to set this aside to let it stiffen up for a little bit, but before I do so, I'm going to compress it with my rubber rib. Compressing the slab is really important. It will make your slabs stronger. I'm going across the surface of the slab with my rubber rib in all different directions, but most importantly, this compression stage is making the slab stronger. I'm taking this material, which has been very stretched out, and I'm compacting it. I'm taking the clay particles inside this wall of clay and I'm making them more dense and more compressed. I want to show you how to do this technique for making a faux leather surface. kind of like a wrinkled leather that I'm thinking some of you might want to have as a surface for the cover on a book. It's also just a really neat technique for manipulating slabs. So I have a pretty soft slab here and it's really smooth and compressed. And I'm gonna go over it with some plastic wrap. You could use any kind of thin plastic for this technique. And then I'm gonna flip it upside down and put a sheet of plastic wrap on the back side too. Once I have the plastic wrap all smoothed out on both sides, I'm gonna go over it with my rolling pin just a little bit. This is really gonna make that plastic wrap cling onto my slab of clay. And I'm gonna do it on the back side too. So it's pretty neat to be able to work with slabs when they're so tightly wrapped in plastic wrap like this, because the plastic wrap holds it together and it lets you manipulate the slab with a little bit of extra support. It lets you pick up and move a larger slab. And as I start to pick it up, what's happening is the plastic wrap is wrinkling the surface of the slab. And I'm gonna come in some areas and get even more focused wrinkles. Try and make them a little deeper and exaggerated. You can see that starting to happen on this slab. So I have a nicely distressed and aged looking wrinkled slab here, and I kind of like the undulation that I have going on, but every time I let go it flattens out a little bit. So to have it firm up in this kind of undulating way, I'm going to go underneath with some crumpled newspaper. That's going to make it look even more like an old weathered book cover. With this plastic wrap in place, it's going to take a long time for it to set up, maybe days. But just for the purpose of this video, I'm going to go ahead and peel some off now and show you, just to say it would probably be more vivid if you let it set on there a while and didn't peel the plastic off until it was less tacky wet. Nice. I think it looks like an old leather book cover. It's still gonna dry a little more slowly because there's still plastic on the back side, and I'll peel that off before I start building with this. I have these two flat slabs that are going to be the two open pages of my book, and I can see here from my maquette I exaggerated a bit to give my book more a sense of opening up and to make the angle that it's sitting at the table a little more dramatic. I think it's important when you're cutting shapes out of your slabs to just cut a little bit at a time. You can always cut more off, but if you make a big cut, it's a lot harder to add back on. You're gonna have a lot of scrap material, and I want to reuse this. So while the clay is still somewhat soft, I'm gonna take these scrap bits and just dunk them in water and work the water in with my fingers, and I'm softening this clay so I can reuse it. So I have these two open pages for my book, but I want them to have a curve to them. I want them to be like a really thick book, and when you lay it open, the pages curl up and fan out towards the edges. So to help set them in that shape, I'm going to come from underneath and put a bend in it. I could actually come and do a little bit of stretching from underneath. I'm moving my fingers across the under part of the slab here, and I'm stretching it to get that curving up and fanning out towards the edge quality. I like working with the slabs and manipulating the shape of them while they're still soft. This is in the late plastic to early cheese hard state. I rolled these slabs out yesterday, and I let them sit for about 24 hours, but they've been wrapped in plastic that whole time. And how long your slabs need to sit to get to the right pliability for what you're building is really going to depend on the weather conditions also. I like that curve that's in there now. And I'm going to go underneath it with crumpled newspaper to hold it in that shape. And then I'm going to let it get to the next state of cheese hard in this shape. A big part of this project is making your books somehow sculptural, somehow dynamic in space, for them to be engaging in all three dimensions. And so I'm trying to think of ways that I can work with these slabs and not have them be flat on the table. If you want to have a flat surface on your book, that's fine, but think about maybe how you could elevate that flat surface up in the air, or maybe have it standing up vertically, or build something that also demonstrates your construction techniques and your ability to join slabs together and build something in space. What would be great is if you could think of ways that your handling of the clay reflected the story that you want to tell. I feel like this angle of the surface coming up off the table is going to make it a lot more dynamic. So I want to have this whole front part of the book be lifting. And that's when I realized that I might need some support underneath inside the structure. So I built this wedge that I'm going to use as a brace. For this piece, I have made a base slab that I'm going to attach everything on top of. Here's my base slab. This surface is not going to show in my final project, but it's going to be a good solid base that I can attach my pages and this internal support to. You can see I made the support pretty thick, and it's really stiff right now. So I'm going to slip and score and attach. I like to use a fork for my slip and score technique, and I go back and forth across the surface in all different directions. And then I'm going to use wet fingertips to get water down into those score marks. Since this is pretty stiff, I'm going to go back and forth over it probably 8 or 10 times. I like to use a fork because it makes really deep marks. As I apply water down in the score marks that I've made, I can feel the clay opening up and becoming more soft and receptive in the area that I'm scoring. It's obviously really important that you do a very thorough job of slip and score attaching with this project. Okay, I'm going to put it together, and then I like to go back and forth a little bit and kind of shimmy it in place. I like to make sure that the teeth marks I've made on either side of this joint get worked into and fully engaged with each other. So I'm gonna wiggle this back and forth, and also I'm compressing the clay particles inside that joint. And I'm gonna go on either side of this joint with a coil of soft clay and further compress the joint and fill in that little gap. When you score it, you actually dig out some of the clay. And sometimes where a joint is, you'll have a little crevice, actually a divot. This isn't going to show. This is just my inside structure. So I'm not too worried about what it looks like, but I do want to make sure that it's compressed and that the clay particles in this joint have the same compaction that the surrounding slab does. And I could really make this kind of a tight square joint if I want to. But like I said, this part isn't going to show in my final project. So what I'm doing right now is really more about compression than cleanup. I talked about wanting that fanned out paper effect on the side. So I cut this edge on an angle instead of cutting it at a 90-degree angle or making a square edge here with the surface of the page. I held my knife at about a 45-degree angle and cut it so that I could get some of that fanned out effect. And I'm going to do the same thing on the base also. Okay, so I have a lot of slip and score joints to make now, one on each side, and I'm gonna join these two slabs onto my internal support in the middle. With each one of these joint areas, I'm gonna go and do the same slip and score process that I did before. You gotta go back and forth a lot. If you don't score deep enough and thoroughly enough or use enough water, your joints won't take. It'll just crack and fall apart as it goes through the rest of the drying and firing process. Okay, so I have my 3 parts all ready to attach, and I'm gonna get them in place. I'm trying to think of this object now as one solid piece of clay instead of 4 different slabs of clay joined together. So I'm going to work on the inside of my structure here. Before I cap it off, I'm going to go inside there with reinforcing coils and put them everywhere I have a joint. Again, this is not to make it look more finished because this part is not going to show, but it's going to make my joints a lot stronger. I'm going around that clay coil I just put in, and I'm working it into the joint, and I'm compressing the joint and finishing it, making it dense and tight. And if there's an area you can't reach with your fingers, you can go in with a wood tool, and I'm going to fill in that joint. Go in everywhere you can while it's still exposed. Ultimately, there's going to be one small area that I'm not going to be able to reinforce from the inside. When I finally cap it off, there's going to be one area that my finger's not going to be able to reach. But while I can reach in there, I'm going to do as much as I possibly can. And I'm going to compress the joints and add a coil on the outer face also. So that's down here, and I'm going to work that in. Now this surface is obviously going to show, so I'm going to work it in more neatly. The rib is also letting me press and firm up this joint area. I like to do a really thorough job when I make my joints. I make a big mess with the fork when I slip and score and when I'm pressing the clay parts together. I like to have that confidence that the joint is well made, and I've gotten into the wall of clay to work it and compress it together. And so I make a mess, and then I spend a lot of time cleaning up. Okay, so I'm gonna cap off this front part of it, and I've made a slab and let this stiffen up for a day or so as well. And I can see here that I need a little bend in the spine area. So I'm going to hold a ruler on there and press in. Then I'm going to bend out these areas too. Now I can use this part of my structure as a guide for cutting it out. So I'm cutting this at an angle. I'm holding my knife at an angle to the surface of the slab that's not perpendicular. Now I'm going to attach this top part on. Once I get this attached, I'm not going to be able to get inside the book anymore. So I really want to make sure that all these joints have been reinforced on the inside before I attach this. And I know since I'm not going to be able to get inside and reinforce this joint very well, that I need to do an even better job of slip and scoring. I notice as I've been working on this that the table underneath my project is getting kind of wet, and the clay wants to stick to that surface, so it might help you in moving it around and not having it get stuck on your board if you put a piece of newspaper underneath. and that'll let me move it around. You don't want your project to get stuck to the board that you're working on. As your piece dries, it needs to be able to freely move, and so a piece of dry newspaper underneath really helps. A wood paddle really helps in compressing a joint. A great tool you probably have at home is the back of a rounded wood kitchen spoon. But you can use any piece of wood that you have. And as you can imagine, right now, those score marks in there are really getting tightly compressed in with each other. I'm going to come on this surface and add a coil in and compress it. I'm going to spend some time cleaning this up also. Working in this reinforcement coil, compressing that joint, and I'm using my rib to smooth it back out and clean it up. One of the things I really like about clay is its ability to look like all different kinds of materials. You can make it look like leather or wood or plant material or paper or fabric. You can make it look like metal. It's like this great chameleon type art material. I'm going to have a lot of interesting stuff going on here with these sculptural flowers and fruit that I'm going to build off of it, but I want this surface to have something for the viewer to appreciate also. So before I put that texture on, I'm going to spend a little bit more time giving it some extra smoothness. You can use a damp sponge to smooth out the surface of your clay, but you'll find that sponging it too much will make the surface gritty. Okay, and then to do my texture, I'm going to try a variety of different tools here. First, I might just use a pencil and see what kind of line that makes. I'm going to go light at first, and I want to exaggerate this fold, this kind of upward and then cascading down quality. And I want it to look very rich in texture. I want it to have this sense of abundance to it, like the abundant fruit that I'm going to put here. So I'm just going to cover this whole surface with marks. I want to completely take over this surface with the texture. So it doesn't look like lines drawn on a slab. Instead, it looks like it's made out of this frayed material. Or I'll go over a texture with my fingertips and kind of smooth it out. And then I'll come back with my texture tool and mark it again. This way I can get kind of a nice balance between a smooth area and a rough area, or I can rough it up without necessarily having to have all those little balls and burrs and clay crumbs all over it. So for me, texturizing is kind of a multi-step process. I'm making the same marks on the side that I did on that upper part. Sometimes it's surprising if you've been working on your piece sitting down on a board the whole time. When you pick it up, there's that little edge that goes all the way around where it meets the table. And if you don't pick it up at some point and round that edge, it can be really rough and unfinished looking. So I usually like to do some final touch so that when it's sitting on that edge, it looks finished and smooth and rounded. And it's really showing people that that's where you intended the clay to end. This is also a good time to get your initials and your unique number on the back side. Remember, you absolutely have to have your initials and your unique number clearly marked in the clay. I can work a few pinholes into this texture here. It'll just help it dry faster, and it'll help make sure that my piece isn't going to blow up. Another alternative would be to put a larger hole on the back side of the piece. This would be helpful if I wanted to ever hang it on the wall. 2 holes lets you maybe wrap a wire through the piece, or it can help me if I have 2 nails holding it up. It can help the piece sit level on the wall and not shift back and forth as it might tend to do if there was only one nail hole. Another kind of texture is wood grain pattern. I like to use a pencil kind of laying down on the surface of the clay, so I actually have a thin line to a thicker line, and I can come up on the point if I want a sharper line. And as I draw it in, I'm gonna go back with my finger and smooth it out. Another nice way you can make your textured surfaces more varied is to go ahead and make some marks and then go back over them with a wet paintbrush to smooth them out. I like to use a paintbrush that's a little stiff or even a little coarse and let the bristles of the paintbrush maybe make some marks on the surface themselves. I like to work the surface of my textures using multiple tools and different ways of holding or using those tools so that the textures become really unique to me. So I have some of the fruit and flowers and leaves that I want to put on here, and since they're thinner, I've been wrapping them completely covered and inside a plastic bag. So these are really good medium cheese hard. So a lot of these shapes I just kind of invented in process of doing. In other words, I didn't have it totally planned out ahead of time what these were going to look like. I'm flinging out this little slab swatch to stretch it a bit. So here I'm going to work with the clay slab when it's really soft. Before I curl this up to make one of these little rose shapes, I'm going to come on the edge and smooth it and round it with wet fingertips. So now I'm going to come starting at one end and just roll it up. And since this clay is really soft as I'm working with it, I can pretty much just on the back side of this pinch it together and it'll stay like that. I don't need to do any slip and score attaching if the clay is this soft. And I have some leaf shapes also that I'm going to add in here. I wanted to have a combination of both round objects and more linear objects, and objects that I could make come out into space, not just things that would stay flat on the surface of the book. I was trying to make this as dynamic as possible. So to do one of these leaf shapes, I'm going to start with a soft, smooth slab, and I'm going to cut out what I think is a leaf shape. And then since this cut edge is now really square and has kind of a sharp corner on it, before I shape the leaf, I'm going to soften the edge and round it with wet fingertips. This slab has just a little bit of stiffness to it. I probably rolled it out about 2 hours ago and it's been sitting out. So that little bit of extra stiffness is helping me in soften this edge and not have the piece just completely distort shape. So I'm rounding the edge with wet fingertips, and then I'm going to start to manipulate the shape. If you want to, you can draw on it first and put some of those lines on there. And I'm going to come from underneath and stretch it out. This will be nice if I have a different color on the back side. You know how leaves can have a different color on the underside from the top face, and if I show some of that in the piece, then I have an opportunity for a different color. But I hope you have fun inventing things for your book project. I hope you have fun thinking about the story that you want to tell and the message. Make something that's unique to you. Don't just make a version of what I made. It might make more sense for you to have a closed book or for you to have a series of books that you can actually put on a shelf. You might not want to have dimensional flowers coming out of your book, but if you do, I hope that you would make them different than mine. In addition to giving your book a title, give us a written description of the thought process that you went through, of the building process that you went through, of the story, the message, and the tone that you want to convey with your book, how you made decisions about the images and the textures and the patterns, text if you have any on your book. I'm going to ask you to talk about all of that and give us some insight into your creative idea process. Why are you making the book that you are actually making? What is it about the shape of your piece? What is it about the pictures, the images, the patterns, the words, the text? Why do you have that all the way that you do in your project? How does that all tie into the message and the meaning, the concept behind your piece? So we're going to work on developing your ideas with this project and how you can best get those across to really express yourself with this piece.